thank you very much for coming to Pune for this conversation. We'll start, as we said, with a little background of how did you come to pick up a historian, a little background or where you grew up, what those influences were growing up, and how you came to be a historian, even though you initially didn't study history.
Thank you, Naushad. Thank you, all of you, Nayanta, for having me here. Listening to Banwali, I saw some very striking parallels between our respective upbringings, with some differences. He grew up in the Pune University campus, which was 400 acres. I grew up at the Forest Research Institute campus, which was 1,600 acres of forest, and much older and much more beautiful buildings, but with parents with similar kinds of values. My father was a scientist. My mother was a high school teacher. They also had many students, and I'm still in touch with the students who write to me from time to time. And they were quite extraordinary in several respects. When I think of what, compared to other upper caste Hindus of that generation, technically they were Brahmins. They did not practice caste. I never wore a thread. And my father said, "You will not wear a thread." There was absolutely no religious discrimination at home, outside. There was an element of patriarchy, but even that was much less than in other families of that time. So my sister was a doctor. There was no question that she would become a professional too, just as I would. And most importantly, there was never any pressure on me to choose a profession that would give me security, prestige, or money. Jo karna tha, karo. And I became a historian completely by accident, Naushad. So, of course, I was fortunate, as were Banmali and my wife Sujata and Parka and Naushad and Ranjan, to grow up in a time when there was no internet. There was no television in my hometown. So we read books. And of course, we listened to the radio, which was a window to the world. So I developed a interest in books and ideas. But my boyhood dream was to play cricket. I knew I was not good enough to play cricket for India, but I wanted to play cricket for the best college team in India, which was the Stevens College, which I did, alongside two future test cricketers, one of whom, 𝘗𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘴, was a member of the 1983 World Cup team. And I drifted into economics. I come from a family of scientists. My father was a scientist. My grandfather was a scientist. My uncle was the first Indian director of the National Chemical Laboratory down the road. But if you want to play cricket, you can't do science because you have practicals in the afternoon. And you can't go for, you can't try out for the team. I was quite good at chemistry. And I stumbled into economics. I wanted to do English literature, Naushad, which may show some early signs of an interest in writing and reading. But back then it was considered, a soft subject. And I started studying economics, and I found I was spectacularly unsuited to it. And fortunately, during my MA, I discovered the works of an anthropologist called 𝘗𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘴, who was an Englishman who came to India and became a great expert on our Adivasi communities. And from there, I drifted into history, and I became a professional historian. One last thing. What cricket can be, I'll say. People who have grown up studying classical music or dance also have a similar kind of story to tell. It can be a taste for disciplined hard work. So the two test cricketers who were in my future test cricketers who were in my college team were Arun Lal, who played 16 test matches for India, and 𝘗𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘴, who was in the World Cup side. Both were batsmen. And I had to bowl for at least 3 hours to beat their bat even once. Because I was a bowler, I was a off spinner. So I think what it gave me was this taste for hard work. Because a historian is essentially a researcher who works for hours and hours and months in archives all over the world, finding new material which is not there in the internet, which is unpublished manuscripts, letters, documents, court records, newspapers. And unlike an economist who deals with ideas, unlike a philosopher who deals with even more abstract ideas, a historian has to be, first of all, interested in empirical research. The writing and the analysis comes later. So in that sense, I'm grateful for all those years as a cricketer because it gave me the taste, the inclination, dare I say, the aptitude for focused hard work.
Like I don't know anyone who's connected cricket and history as effectively as you just did. And also, by the way, Ram has 3 books on cricket, right?
Yeah.
So, and one of the, by the way, and one of the part about St. Stephen's, Ram has a nice small book called The Cooking of Books, and the first few chapters in the book are actually about St. Stephen's and the cricket team and so on. Yeah.
So there was an interesting story you had told about how cricket influenced your choice of subjects. How you came to study sociology and then history.
No. So cricket maybe drop science and take economics because I was free in the afternoons. Yeah.
Move on a bit to, so you started writing very early on, and your first book was on Ferry Aylwin.
No. Was it? My first book was a PhD thesis, which I am proud to say is still in print almost 40 years later. It's called The Unquiet Woods, and it's a book on the relationship between peasants and forests in the Himalaya, ending in the 𝘔𝗂𝘵 movement, the celebrated forest protection movement. So that was my first book. Aylwin came a little later.
Okay. So how did you become such a popular historian?
Well, you see, Naushad.
I remember once, many years ago. I mean, my first contact with India after Gandhi was at Singapore airport, of all places. And there used to be there's still a decent bookshop, but there used to be a really good bookshop there. And this is when I was still teaching and so on. And I remember seeing it at Singapore airport, a big stack.
Yeah, so that happened. So I was first, you could say, a professional historian who wrote occasionally in the press. So I wrote several books on environmental history, including 2 in collaboration with a very great ecologist who belonged to Pune, called Madhav Katyal. Then I wrote on Aylwin. Then I wrote a social history of cricket. And I began writing occasionally for the press because history is a discipline that's in between social science and literature. And of course, you use detailed empirical research, you use your analytical mind. But essentially, you're writing about human beings, their emotions, their relationships, their struggles, their conflicts. So unlike if you're a physicist or if you're an economist or if you're a philosopher, if you do really high quality intellectual work in, shall we say, microeconomics or the theory of finance, you can't communicate the depth and the subtlety and the nuances of your research in everyday language. You have to dumb down. If you're a physicist or an astronomer, you have to use a certain kind of technical language. But history is a discipline in which you can communicate the depths of your research in everyday prose. So I started writing a little bit in the press. But one of the essays I wrote, this is actually quite an interesting story. Since you mentioned India after Gandhi, and for better or for worse, now I think more for the worse, I'm known as the author of India after Gandhi. And rather than some of the other books, which actually I'm more proud of, and I may talk about them. But for better or for worse, that's what I'm known as. And the story, it's the story of an academic entrepreneur. So I had published again, this is a Pune connection to this. So I wrote a book on cricket, which is a social history of cricket, whose heroes are a family of Dalit cricketers from Pune, who were the first great Indian cricketers at the turn of the 19th and the early 20th century. There was an extraordinary man called Palwankar Balu, who caught 150 wickets on the first All India tour of England in 1911. He was a Dalit from Pune. So I wrote an essay about caste and cricket, and this remarkable man, who was Ambedkar's early hero, by the way, and also knew Gandhi, and played a role. Again, we're talking about Pune. Balu played a role in the Pune pact between Ambedkar and Gandhi. So I written an essay on a scholarly essay, published in a scholarly history journal printed out of Oxford called Past and Present, which was probably the most prestigious social history journal in the world. So I got a phone call from a publisher in London saying he wanted to meet me. So I said, okay. And he was carrying past and present, he had that issue with my artillery like this, with the essay on the colored cricketer. And he said, what are you doing next? I said, I'm expiling that into a book, that essay on caste and cricket. I said, no, 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 no. This was 1997. He said, no, 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 no. Write a history of independent India, he said. I said, what? I'd written on environment, I'd written on Elvin, I'd written on cricket. He said, the publisher's name was Peter Strauss, he worked with Macmillan. He said, India has just completed 60 years of independence, is that right? I said, yes. It's a miracle they've stayed together for 60 years, is that right? I said, yes. Now there's economic reform taking place, you're going to grow materially and you're going to conquer the image that you're a poor country, is that right? I said, yes. Then he said, is it true that most Indian historians work on the colonial period, on the national movement, on the evil that the British Raj has done, and they don't come beyond 47? Is that right? I said, yes. Then he said, why don't you correct that and write a history of independent India? I mean, it's really a publishing entrepreneur. I said, give me a few months, I'll think about it. I went back to Bangalore, and 8 weeks later, Peter Strauss called me and said, will you write this book? I said, okay. And it was kind of terra nullius. No one had ever looked at the history of India since 1947. As people used to say, and I began to joke, and many of you have studied history in school and college, or at least in high school, that when the clock struck midnight on 14th stroke 15th August 1947, when the clock struck midnight, history ended and civics began. Now, we had 60 years of independence, an incredibly interesting tumultuous period of nation building, of conflict, of insurgency, of the great leaders who may sometimes make great mistakes. And I was able to write that book. But it was, by the way, I've written many books. This is the only book somebody else asked me to write. So it's really, and of course it then became what's called in the trade a crossover book. That from being a historian who was read mostly by scholars and occasionally by citizens, I became, writing for a much wider public. And one last thing I'd say, I think which may be relevant to many of the people in this room. I reflect a lot on that book and how I wrote it. It took a decade. I missed many deadlines, and at one stage, I was finding it so difficult to write and conceptualize that the folder in my laptop was called Mythical History Book, because I thought I will never get to write it. No, I wrote it. But when I reflect on this, this is something very, and I was commissioned when I was 40. It was published when I was 49. I could only have written it in my 40s. In my 20s and 30s, because look at the epic scale, right? In my 20s and 30s, I had to write more niche, specialized books. I lacked the kind of maturity, the gravitas, the intellectual ambition to take on this kind of project. And if I had started it when I was 50, I'd have been too old. I wouldn't have had the energy to plow through archives all over the world. So it's like, so it's a base. What it was true for me as a historian, maybe true for many people in this room. Like it's in your 40s and possibly in your 50s that you really can do your best work. Not in your 60s and not in your 20s.
That's a very good message, I think. But wait until we finish the conversation before you head off. So now, when you've written many other wonderful books, right? You've got these collections of essays which are wonderful. One of my favorites, as you know, is relatively recent, is Rebels Against the Raj.
Right.
And the comment that I'd made to Ram when I read Rebels Against the Raj was, you have, the stories are wonderful and really interesting. But more than anything else, I think, except for maybe Annie Besant, I think all the others would have been forgotten.
Yes.
If you hadn't written that book. And they're all unique individuals. They're the reason we have apples in Himachal. they're the reason we have Horniman Circle in Bombay.
Correct.
Right? They're the reason that there are a whole set of things that exist in the country that we do not appreciate adequately. And I think, was there a degree of motivation to kind of capture the life of people whose life needs to be captured, that history needs to be recorded? I mean, what motivates you to write a book like that?
Purely, you could say, literary and intellectual ambition, not professional ambition. Because I'm thrilled you liked it so much, because it's actually not sold very well. So it won a prestigious prize in England, and it's a book I'm very proud of. So essentially, I wrote a two-volume biography of Gandhi, which is like 2,000 pages. Now, this is a collective biography of 7 white people who went to jail during the freedom struggle, and many of them stayed on after independence and did really interesting things in India, right? And one of the guys was who was actually deported was Horniman of Horniman Circle, who was a British journalist who ran the Bombay Chronicle, which was an Indian nationalist newspaper.
And
Very interesting.
And broke the story on the Jallianwala
Broke the story on the Jallianwala Bagh.
and got deported as a result.
So, again, if I may be slightly anecdotal here, the first biography I wrote was of Very Railway. And when I began working on it 40 years ago, biography is a genre that does not come naturally to Indians, because they're excessively worshipful, and of course, a biography requires also a certain literary flair, which not all Indian historians have. But sometimes you could write 2,000 pages on Gandhi. But sometimes, a more interesting way of, in this case, was none of them really deserved a book on their own. Or if they did, they don't really. But here I was able to connect 7 white people who come during the time when we are still a colony, who go over to our side. They are actually, I call them renegades. They identify with the colonized people, with their struggle, with their cause, got arrested, and each of them does interesting things. And also, all of them had a connection with Gandhi. All 7 knew Gandhi. Some were actually critical of Gandhi, some were appreciative of Gandhi. And it was, this is a very interesting phenomenon. I think I, again, urge all of you to reflect on this. What does it take for a white man in 1920, born a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, born into a race that is a dominant race, practicing a religion, Christianity, which is a dominant religion, to take the side of poor, vulnerable Hindus and Muslims who are brown-skinned? Now, it's like, I'll give some. What does it take for a man to shed his patriarchy and identify with the feminist movement? What does it take for a Brahmin to work for the oppressed of low caste? What does it take, and this is one parallel that inspired me, to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa? There were about several dozen radical whites who identified with Mandela and the African National Congress. Some of them were jailed, 1 or 2 of them were even assassinated by the apartheid police. So what does it take to abandon your privilege? Because you feel passionately about people who are disprivileged, and you want to identify with them, I think one other example I'd give, and maybe I'll say this out loud, if I may, about my father. One of the most extraordinary things about my father was his closest friend was gay. I'm talking about the 1940s. His closest friend was a scientist called 𝗏𝗂 Acharya, who was my father's classmate at the Division of Science, who later on became the great historian of Indian food. He wrote famous books on Indian food. And when I was 14, my father, and even my boss father, Dr. Acharya, my father told me, he said, Kammu Mama is homosexual, but that's fine. It's all fine in this world. Now, just think of that. What does it take to identify a normal heterosexual to identify with a sexually discriminated kind of person? So I think Rebel Siddharth, it was amazing. Let me tell one last story about Rebel Siddharth, since you mentioned it. The working title was Renegades. Renegades Western fighters for India's freedom. Because a renegade is different from a bridge builder. You know, we are in the campus of Christopher Bennington, who was American or British? American. Christopher Bennington was a bridge builder. He had come with good intentions to build good relations. C.F. Andrews, who worked with Gandhiji, was a bridge builder. You know, many of the doctors and teachers who came during the Raj were bridge builders in that they were trying to build bridges, they were not renegades. A renegade is a person who identifies, who betrays his or her cause for a greater cause. So the title was Renegades, and the dedication of the book was to 𝘠𝘩𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬, who's a Belgian-born economist who is now one of India's leading development economists, to 𝘠𝘩𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬, a renegade of our time. And I wanted to call it Renegade still 6 months before the book was published. So the traveling title had been Renegades for a decade. Then shortly before the book was published, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen published a book called Renegades. And I was not about to compete with them. So it became Rebels Against the Raj, which is kind of, okay. But it has this larger message, you know.
Yeah.
What does it take for, I'll give you one last example. You all know the Sarabhais? Yeah. Now, Ambalal Sarabhai was the founder of the Sarabhai enterprise, was a textile magnate in Ahmedabad. All of you would know the Sarabhais. How many of you here at Naushad is accepted, and possibly Banwali? How many of you here have heard of his sister, Annasuya Ben Sarabhai? None. She was the wife of the sister of Ambalal Sarabhai, who organized a trade union in the Sarabhai mills to fight for higher wages for the workers. No, I mean, and by the way, no one here has heard of Annasuya Ben Sarabhai, which is fine. Most of you have heard of Ela Bhatt and Seva. Annasuya Sarabhai was the mentor of Ela Bhatt and Seva. So I think this lesson, what does it take for a person born into privilege to empathize, to identify, to care for those who just have the bad luck to be born on the wrong side of the track? So I think that's really the lesson of the book. Yeah.
So I wanted to move to another topic, which is, I know I heard what you said about India after Gandhi. It still remains one of my 5 favorite books, in spite of what you said about it.
Okay.
So if it has a hero, it's Nehru, right? In terms of laying the foundation for the country that we are now. It's also pretty critical of him.
Yes.
Right. And what does it take for someone as a leader to be both a great leader and human at the same time without losing that humanity? Because I think one of our big problems, I would argue, in the country is that want to respect someone as a leader, we dehumanize them. We expect them to be somehow perfect, godlike or something. It's and I really worry about that, because every great leader in history probably has been very human, and has had flaws.
So before I come to that, answer that question about Nehru, I'd like to go back to something that Banmali said about we don't think big. You said, we did once, and that's how we set up the Republic of India. I mean, I sometimes give a talk in Bangalore to young people, and I say, if India had been a startup in August 1947, no one would have invested in it. Just think of India in 1947, coming out of the Bengal famine, desperate scarcity, poverty, partition, bloody religious riots, 10 million refugees, the princely states, all fragmented, wanting to be independent on their own, a Cold War looming between Russia and America, and yet this, because Nehru and his colleagues, in preeminently Sardar Patel, but also Ambedkar and others, thought big, because Gandhi thought big. Gandhi said, I will build a republic in which religious and linguistic differences and caste and gender inequalities will be overcome. So I think that is an example of what Indians thought big. I mean, people completely underestimate the challenges that people like Nehru and Patel faced when India became independent. I can tell you, no Indian politician alive today would have been able to build India from the fragments in 1947. Each one of them, whether they're in government or opposition today, would have run away somewhere else. I can tell you that put the range of the colossal scale of the challenges. Now, I think Nehru, of course, this is something which requires a further discussion, but Patel and Nehru worked together. Nehru was one and Patel was two. But today unfortunately, WhatsApp history has made them rivals and adversaries. They were not that at all. They had differences. Patel united India territorially, not just by bringing the princely states on board, but by building the IAS, and a modern administrative service. So Patel united India territorially. Nehru united India emotionally, north and south. Nehru was uniquely, that's why Gandhi chose him as his successor. Nehru was uniquely a Hindu who wanted equal rights for Muslims, a North Indian admired in South India, and a man who wanted equal rights for women. Let me tell you, except for Gandhi and Nehru, every other male leader of the Congress party, including Patel, including Rajagopalachari, including Rajendra Prasad, they were all 10% patriarchs who believed that a woman must be the home, she must not vote, she must not become an MP, God forbid. And Nehru had that. So I think that's how they work together. Now, of course, there were some outstanding civil servants too, social workers, and that whole team built India. And of course, they had the wisdom when independence came to bring in people like Ambedkar, who, even though he was from a different party, to head them. Now, and one last thing I'd say about Nehru, which one of my teachers told me many, many years ago, a teacher who had grown up in the 30s and 40s and with Nehru, and the aura of Nehru and Gandhi. She said something which has stayed with me for a very long time. She said, a mark of Nehru's greatness was that he knew Gandhi was much the greater man. How many of our leaders think anyone is greater than them? And not just in politics, in the corporate sector too, or in sport or whatever, right? And I think that was part of what was going on. One last thing I'll say about Nehru, by the way, since Naushad has recommended it so enthusiastically, do buy India After Gandhi. It may take you 6 months to read it in between all your busy commitments, but then you can see what I've said there. I've been reflecting a lot on Nehru after I wrote that book. And occasionally been asked to write a book on Nehru himself, but I don't think I want to do it. But I'd say, Nehru's reputation would be much higher than it is now. I think it's undeservedly low. I think it's pretty much higher than it is today. But it would be even higher if he'd known when to retire. This is something that Banmali also raised, this question. If he had retired in 1958, Nehru had done a decade as Prime Minister. He'd been a leader of the freedom struggle. He'd been 13 years in jail. Then, with the help of Patel and Ambedkar, he'd built a unified republic, give it a democratic template, a federal structure, started the IITs, given India a sort of important place in the world. And in 1958, he went to Kashmir on a holiday and said, I must retire. And he came back and he decided not to retire. Now, we know that he went for a holiday, that he thought of retiring. We don't really know why he did not retire. Now, there are two plausible speculations. One is the admirers and the sycophants around him who said, "Aapko rehna hai, nahi to desh barbaad ho jayega, sir, aapke bina desh nahi chalega," and all that. The other is somewhere he felt he still had things to do, right? But I think that is, again, one, and I think the British writer Enoch Powell once said, every political life ends in failure unless cut off in midstream. Subhash Bose and Rajiv Gandhi were cut off in midstream. every political, now there's only, I mean, of course, yeah, Americans don't count because they have term limits. The only exception to that is Mandela, who retired. And I think Mandela knew, because Mandela was an admirer of Nehru. We studied his, but even then, I think that, see, Nehru's, I think, Nehru grew up, a part of Nehru's greatness is not innate. It is working with Gandhi. It's also working in the Congress Party. You know, the Congress Party of Nehru's day was very different from the Congress Party of today. On in any political party, virtually every political party today is a cult. You know, either of a one leader or one family. The Congress was a decentralized show. There was debate, there was argument. I mean, I would say, since we are in the process of recommending books, even before you read India After Gandhi, or certainly after you read India After Gandhi, please read The Discovery of India, which Jawaharlal Nehru wrote in Ahmednagar jail. And in the preface to Discovery of India, I don't know whether you remember, Naushad, there's a one very long para of what his jailmates taught him, what Sardar Patel taught him, what Maulana Azad taught him, what Kripalani taught him, what Rajendra Prasad taught him, what Asaf Ali taught him.
K.M. Munshi.
No, K.M. Munshi was not easy. K.M. Munshi never went to jail during the freedom struggle, so K.M. Munshi did not teach him. Sorry.
He said he learned about the Rigveda and Mahabharata from K.M. Munshi.
Oh, okay. Thank you again. But who was actually an opponent of his later? Yeah. So who all he learned from? Right. So, I mean, can you think? I mean, it's a wonderful passage because here is a man saying, I learned about my country from so many other people. You know, and he says there, he says, they knew the languages I did not know, the parts of India I did not know. Now, that is, so for him, the Congress was his family. And he was learning from, like we learn from our siblings, our children, our parents. I think that was part of the Grundim letter. And the Congress from the time Gandhiji takes it over in about 1920, till the time Indira Gandhi splits it in 1970. I mean, it's one of the great political parties in the modern world. In those 50 years, what were it built? I mean, again, if I may do one last point. One of the reasons India has done so much better than Pakistan is the difference between the Congress Party and the Muslim League. The Muslim League was a party of Nawabs and Talukdars and lawyers. The Congress was a party of no princes, lawyers, teachers, but peasants, workers, artisans, women. Sarojini Naidu was president of the Indian National Congress in 1925. You know, when women were in no positions of political authority anywhere in the world. You know, and for someone who's a historian of the Congress Party, to see the Congress Party today, you know, it really breaks my heart. Because it really had built the republic. And Nehru was reared in that. And the preface to the Discovery of India shows that, you know, that he was part of this extraordinary group, as I suppose some builders of companies are, you know, when they start a company, you know, that they have this, and one person eventually comes out on top and becomes CEO. But it's that ecosystem of affairs.
Do flaws make a leader less of a leader? Do they make the leader more human?
Of course they make him more human. I mean, all of us are flawed. In Nehru, I said...
We have our great line, right? We're all works in progress.
Yeah, we're all.
So I think one point. You see, I think Nehru, when Patel died, Nehru missed a number two. Or a person he considered almost an equal. Rajaji could have become. Again, Naushad likes people to recommend books, so I'm going to recommend books. The best book on Nehru still is a 200-page book on him written by a man called Walter Crocker, who was Australian High Commissioner to India for a decade in the 1950s. It's called Nehru, A Contemporary's Estimate. And there he has a line which I'm going to quote now. He says, Rajaji and Nehru should have worked together after Patel died. Because, you know, Rajagopalachari was an intellectual equal of Nehru's. Of course, he was not a political mass leader, but, you know, he was more interested in entrepreneurship, innovation, decentralization. And he says this. He says, the fault was owed to both men that they did not reach out to the other. So I'd say, had Nehru had that kind of person around him, the way Patel was, maybe some of these flaws would not have happened.
Also, it's a slight digression from the direction, but one of the things I've now observed in many interactions is that you're a great communicator. How did you learn to write? And how do you approach written and oral communication differently?
The golfer Gary Player, who was a great South African golfer in the 1960s. And at a time when there were more, shall we say, it was a time of great golfers like Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer and so on. He was called a lucky golfer. And he said, the harder I practice, the luckier I get. Okay, so writing is practice. Now, on whether I'm a great communicator, my wife will have strong disagreements with you. She thinks particularly on question time, I'm too adversarial. That like I'm happy to adversarial with you about your comment about the British. And she's probably right. But you see, writing is practice. So writing requires a great amount of solitude. So when you write, you don't have your smartphone with you. You are just consumed by what you had. Communication, I think, is different. I think communication comes from. I don't think I'm a great communicator. For example, I could never get into the college debating team, and that may have been because Swapan Dasgupta and Swapan Dasgupta and Shashi Tharoor I was competing with them. So it's become over time, and it's because I think it's because you study something in depth, so you can talk about it. It's like a teacher, So, but writing is something which is, again, I'd say about writing, I think it's practice. It's also, again, writers have a peak. And there's no false modesty here. I think I've passed my peak. Banmali talked about music. Now, Ravi Shankar would give a perfectly accomplished sitar recital in his 70s. But it was not the Ravi Shankar of the 40s or 50s. He'd been going on for so long that he would close his eyes and do something. People thought, right? So writing also is something where you grow, you mature. But essentially it's practice and thinking and endless revising. So one of the few battles I've won with my son, who's a novelist, who's a writer but a novelist, is I've finally been able to persuade him that whenever you write something, print it out. Don't edit on the screen. Because on paper it looks kacha. You know what? So that's what I say. But I think communication is only because I don't speak on, I would never speak on economics, or on technology. So if you have that grounded information which you slogged away acquiring for decades, I'm only speaking on my books, right? I'm not speaking on anything else.
So even in this interview, right, if you're communicating, there are no notes. There's no points you've made. There's flow, there's structure, there's storytelling. All three are there in every time you've spoken. How does that come about? How you build?
Ranjan, that's my profession. Very rosy roti hai. I mean, I can't run Nayanta. I can't run all the companies these young men are running. Young women are running. It's my rosy roti. It's riyaz. It's like music. Okay, it's hours and hours of practice, right? And that's what it is.
So there are many academics who do great academic work, and they write a lot, but they write horribly. I mean, they.
I'm sure he could find historians of which he says.
Oh yes, I'm sure.
So I think history is this. See, I say a physicist. I don't expect a physicist to be a great writer. They're doing something very conceptual and complicated. But history is that actually I don't even expect economists. So some economists are very good writers. Some are. I think both Sen and Bhagwati, whatever their disagreements on economic policy, are very fine writers as writers. Yeah. Robert Solow was a wonderful writer. Paul Samuelson was an outstanding writer. So they have that clarity. Though they may be simplifying their thoughts. But history is at that. With history, unfortunately, because too many professional historians either can't write well enough or they use an excessive amount of academic jargon, have ceded the space of history writing to opportunistic amateurs or even charlatans. And that's a mistake. And the British, again, I'll say one thing about my influences. I think the best American historians, by and large, write a clunky prose. The exceptions, Richard Hofstadter would be an exception of the older generation. In my book recommendations, I've recommended you American historians who's outstanding. But British and French historians, I think, pay attention to style. And they have been my main influences.
Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
Because I think about Ram reads.
How?
He reads a lot of very well written. And he has always, I think for years and years, he's read fine writing. And then that must affect your own writing, right?
Yeah, because I do widely outside history too. So I read memoir, biography.
So a question on, since we're on that topic, it's a question that I've often asked, and I've never got really good answers to it. Even people who claim to be great readers. Now, the question I ask is, do you read for content, or do you read for the quality of the writing, or do you read both?
It depends. Sometimes I only read for content.
Only for
I mean,
content.
I just finished a book, which I may recommend later on, which is not the best work of prose by a historian, but it's incredibly insightful.
Okay.
So it just depends.
Okay. Yeah. We'll come back to that reading in a bit. So last topic, and then we'll open it up, is, as I mentioned, we'd like to talk about what's your dream for India, realistic dream for India. And, when you say realistic dream, I suppose one needs a kind of time frame. So, maybe 10 years, something, say a reasonable time frame. And then second, what role do we as individuals and individuals with positions of where we can do something, but what's our role in that dream?
So, Naushad, I am going to disappoint you. I'm going to duck the second question completely.
Okay, sure.
Because
We can each answer it. Yeah.
I believe, firstly, the first question also I will partly duck, not wholly. I believe the duty of a historian is to reflect, document, analyze. Most historians don't even write about the present. I write about the present, so I write about the past and the present. But I have come to believe, partly through mistakes I make, that a historian should not be in the business of prescription. They can be descriptive analysis, critique, documentation, but not prescription. And I cannot prescribe to people who are in very different professions from mine what to do. But the first, what are my dreams for India? Even that I will answer only indirectly and publicly. And I answer that in terms of actually a person I admire, like Nehru. Just as Nehru thought Gandhi was much a greater man, I also think Gandhi was much a greater man than Nehru or any other Indian of modern times. Gandhi defined Swaraj only once. Now, what did Gandhi want from a free India? Now, you're asking me what does Gandhi want from India in its 80th decade of independence. Gandhi defined Swaraj only once, and I'm going to give you a description, and then I'm going to give you my personal gloss on what that description means for me today. So in 1922, Gandhi defined Swaraj. Now, this is a rather heavy stool, so I won't lift it up, but you can see it. He said, Swaraj is a stool with 4 legs. This also has 4. Okay. Swaraj is a stool with 4 sturdy legs. These are Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and promotion of Khaddar. And then he said, each stool should be sturdy. Each leg should be sturdy. If one leg is rusted, unsteady, the whole tool will fall. Now, I'm going to give you my contemporary gloss on those 4. India is still, my definition of India today, tomorrow, day after, is of a stool with 4 sturdy legs. The first leg, when Gandhi says non-violence, I endorse it. non-violence means debate, dialogue, democracy. Also, non-violence in conversation or in argument. That's something I can be excessively polemical, but non-violence. The second stool, Hindu-Muslim harmony, absolutely. The third stool, abolition of untouchability. To that, I would add abolition of gender distinctions as well. Because caste and gender are the two fundamental axes of inequality in India today, and we made some progress in the last 80 years, but much more. And the fourth, on economic self-reliance. I mean, when he says promotion of 𝘗𝘓, he means economic self-reliance, not self-reliance in the shut yourself out of the world way, but, an economy that is growing, that keeps its populations secure from want and poverty, that gives them opportunity. And what gloss I'd add to that, the fourth, on Gandhi and the economy, is environmental sustainability. I've spent much of my career working on environmental sustainability. And I think that's been the great weakness of the post-liberalization era. We needed to liberalize the economy in all directions, but we needed to retain the environmental safeguards, which none of our governments in 1991 have done. Not Narasimha Rao, not Vajpayee, not Manmohan Singh, and not Narendra Modi. Which is why today we are an environmental disaster zone. I mean, we have the highest rates of air pollution in the world. I mean, our rivers are biologically dead. Our groundwater aquifers are depleting at an alarming rate. Our soil is toxic beyond our imagination. And our forests are degraded. And this is all independent of climate change. Climate change makes it all worse. So the question mark that our rapacious abuse of the environment over the last 30 years, the question mark that raises about long-term sustainability of economic growth. So I would say, in a sense, Gandhi's vision of Swaraj with these modifications would be mine.
That's a pretty powerful answer. Even if you said obliquely, I think the very direct answer. Let's go to the floor for questions. Yeah. Start with Asim. Asim Mehulnyal. You take two at a time. That's it.
Wonderful, thanks. So it's wonderful to listen to you. Maybe the third session with you, and always be here, and it's mind blowing. So the point I want to make, it's a comment and then maybe one question. So the comment is that you mentioned about these four pillars. You mentioned about the harmony. You mentioned about non-violence. You mentioned about diversity. You mentioned about gender equality. In 1947, you've spoken about all these things. And at that point of time, it looked like a progressive mentality. We are here in 2026, and it still feels like a progressive mentality. I mean, 79 years, but we are still talking about this, and we still want to achieve this. The question this was a comment. The question I wanted to ask is a fairly simple question. With the thoughts that you have you ever thought of entering into politics?
I'd like to give you a truthful answer. In 2014, it'll be a slightly long story, but wait. So, in 2014, I was the first volume by Gandhi biography came out, and I was giving talks in America. I was in Houston. This is April 2014. The Aam Party had just been set up and was fighting, I think, for 400 seats in 2014. I had a dream in Houston saying, I should join the Aam Party. Rajmohan Gandhi, who had joined the Aam Party, a great scholar, had asked me to join it. Pratap Bhanu Mehta was advising me to join it. They were taking me to meet Kejriwal, and I should join the Aam Party. So I caught up at Houston at 3 a.m. and I said, maybe, what is the use of writing all these rotten books? It has no impact. I should join politics, and I can. So I called my wife. She was in Bangalore. I said, "Are you crazy? Go back to sleep." Okay. So I know there's a sequel. There's a sequel. Then in 2018, the second volume by Gandhi biography came out. And I said, now these are the huge books, so do I have any more books to read? I was alone in Bangalore. Sujata was in, I think, London. My children were studying overseas. And I had a dream again. That I said, I've done my Gandhi book. And I will join the Aam Aadmi Party. I will go back to my hometown, Dehradun, and I will brush up on my Hindi, and then I called her up, and this time she didn't say, go back to sleep. She said, if you entertain that thought for one more minute, I will divorce you. Okay, nothing coming true. Now, what do these tell you? What do these dreams tell you? They tell you that a writer feels, all I'm doing is writing books. I'm not changing the world. It also tells you a little bit about the kind of hope that the Aam Aadmi Party once had. Or many of you in this room will know that it was not communal, it was not dynastic, it was not corrupt, there was
no background in politics.
But ultimately I said, actually, by the way, so you're talking about book titles. The second time when I had the dream, before I rang up Sujata, I woke up, I thought about it. I said, look, I should do it. And I know I'll lose. And I'll fight from Dehradun and I'll lose. And I said, I'll get a book out of it. And I thought of the title, Doomed in the Dune. An aging writer's quixotic attempt to win an election from his hometown. Okay. From his long-abandoned hometown. Now, I even had that, So, but I think it shows you that eventually you think that, again, this is a lesson which, again, is broader. What you can do, do it well. Don't think you should do something else. I mean,
I had a question for Banmali, and I'll connect both of you. I think we heard about Norwegian, country and the achievement that they've made, and also there's this whole different view about the work ethics, where we talk about let's put 70 hours a week, and you talked about writing over and over again, and there's a piece of mastery to it. So when we think about really leading the world, how should we think about quantity versus quality, going deep versus putting more? What's your sense about attaining mastery in the context of world leadership?
You see, again, it is difficult for me to answer, because for me, it is, because you're the mastery, it's mastery over my craft. So obviously you would hope that it would reach many people. But it's not, I'm not really, the work I do is very different from the work, all of you do. I think it's also important to know when to knock off. I mean, I was very interested that Banmali talked about music, because for me, Indian classical music means everything after work. And it actually also contributes to the work the next day. So I think, again, this may be a completely trite recommendation to make the people in this room. But people who have some interest outside work. It could be art, it could be literature, it could be photography, it could be music. I think it not only takes it nourishes your work too, in some way.
Sir, I'm Gajetru from Pralsantire. Since you are a historian and economist both.
I'm not an economist.
I mean, you studied.
I'm a failed economist.
You failed. So, this Swaraj, or the growth of economy, at which juncture we failed? And at which point, since you are a historian, can you...
Yeah. So, I'll say, as a historian, I'd say, and this will be it'll be a defense of Nehru. Okay. And I'll explain to you why we failed. So, it is a complete myth, or not a complete myth, but a substantial myth that Nehru imposed the command economy model on India. That was the consensus among the intellectuals at the time. The Bombay Plan of 1946 was signed by the Tatas, the Birlas, the Seeram Group, the top industrialists in India. They all said, we don't have the capital to invest in heavy industry, in steel, in power, in infrastructure. The government was doing. So that was the received wisdom. The second 5-year plan, which advocated heavy industry, was shown to the 24 top economists. 23 approved. Only one, 𝘗𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘴 disapproved. Now, Nehru was going with the dominant consensus. By the late 50s, when Rajagopalachari had started the Swatantra Party, and he coined the phrase license, permit, quota, Raj, I think it could have been opened out a bit. J.R.D. Tata wrote to him. In fact, this J.R.D. Tata and Birla had a very interesting correspondence, which I've written about, not in India after Gandhi, but elsewhere. J.R.D. said, we should tell Nehru that he has to open up the economy. And Birla said, no. We are getting some favors anyway. Let it be like that. Okay. Now, you see, today the situation is not, who are the Birlas and who may have, so that. So, but the real culprit was Indira Gandhi. By the early to mid 60s, it was very clear that an infrastructural base, industrial base had been built. There was, higher education, and South Korea was opening up. South Korea, Taiwan, they were all opening up. And people like Jagdish Bhakwati and T.N. Srinivas were writing about opening up the economy. It was very clear. And Indira Gandhi further nationalized. Why did she further nationalize? To capture control of the Congress party and present herself as a socialist interested in Garibiya now. So Nehru has some blame, but the major blame for delaying the onset of economic liberalization is really Indira Gandhi, so in the late 60s. One last thing I'd say. In my view, Nehru, many of the mistakes Nehru made, other people would have made them too. China and India were bound to clash. I've written about extend India after Gandhi. Two large countries coming out of a colonial background, finding themselves clashing at the border. And it was actually, India-China war, 3,000 people died, which is less than a communal riot. It was a skirmish. But his real mistake was private education, which is what Bhushan alluded to. If Gandhi had been alive, because Gandhi was a basic, a grassroots man, I think, though it is said that primary education was a state subject and Nehru could only do so much, I think that's an area in which he should have focused on. Economy really was Indira Gandhi's fault. Yeah.
So on the lighter note, if you want to go to politics, you need to write a book, India after 2014.
It's something to talk about holding two opposite ideas. What would have been the book? Tell us if you would have written about Jinnah and Savarkar.
About?
Savarkar.
You see, I would never have wanted to write a book on Savarkar. It never entered my mind. I would never have wanted to. It doesn't excite me. I said I had briefly thought about writing a book about Nehru. I have thought seriously about writing a book on Ambedkar. And especially after my Gandhi biography came out, several people have approached me, including on flights. Someone holding my Gandhi biography and saying, sir, why don't you write on Dr. Ambedkar next? Because, you see, Savarkar, I'll tell you about Savarkar. Without meaning to criticize him, which I could do also. Savarkar is an Indian figure. In fact, he's a Hindu figure. He's not even an Indian figure. Ambedkar, Gandhi, Tagore are universal figures. What they say, think is of interest and relevance to the whole world. I mean, among the modern Indians, only these three. Maybe Nehru, but I would even exclude Nehru. Ambedkar, Gandhi and Tagore are really universal figures. So I would have considered writing on Ambedkar had I not been now in my late 60s. So he is an extraordinary person who deserves, there's a good book on him written by a person based in Pune called Ashok Gopal, which I would recommend. But people like Ambedkar and Gandhi and Tagore deserve multiple biographies from multiple perspectives. So if I had been 10 years younger, I think I'd have written something on Ambedkar. Because Ambedkar was the great emancipator of the Dalits. Ambedkar was the great emancipator, but he was much more. He was a really original constitutional thinker too. So there were many other things to his work. Yeah.
Ram, question from me. We have discussed in Bhushan's lecture and this notion of civic sense, and you alluded it jokingly saying history ended and civic began. But the whole nation, as it's becoming richer, and I go back to that industry's purpose beyond just with clay creation, it was really contrasting, Manmali, when you were talking about going to village and seeing this great sense of civility and decency and this human emotion of one-to-one emotional connect versus the civic behavior that we see around. And it was interesting, and I quote you, you said, I felt proud as a nation, this is the country that I want to belong with, versus the civic behavior we see, which at times once embarrassed as a nation. Where does this contradictory nature of behavior in society has got engraved?
I think obviously the caste system has something to do with it, because the caste system, somebody is always cleaning up after you. There are exceptions. I think the Northeast and Kerala are places where you'd find actually a greater degree of community spirit. It's hard to, I'd say one of the commendable, I'm not, as most of you know, I'm not a particular fan of the present Prime Minister. But one of his commendable initiatives was Swachh Bharat. But he gave it up too early. I think that was somewhere which could really have been.
Just one comment on that, and then, because when we read as psychologists in business, it is very often put as a notion that we are a collective society, whereas West is a more individual society. But the behavior seems to be
I have a different version of that. We are compassionate at the personal level, not at the collective level. If our neighbor falls sick, we will spend weeks in the hospital looking after our neighbor. Right. But in the West, the hospital will take care of. The neighbor is not going to do. So I think at the first, there's a kind of a personal and collective disjunction between us and the West.
And actually, just to follow up that point, do you buy this argument about us not being an individual society?
Because they have any.
I don't actually.
There have been some scholars who have written in the past that there has been individualism. Of course, expressed very clearly in renunciation would be one example. And of course, with capitalism, and of course, it becomes more and more. If you look at the nuclear family breaking down, and even down with the joint family breaking down. So it is true that, unlike in the West, family, caste, and religion play a much more important role. It's family, caste, and religion. Those are our three kind of anchors of identity. And those don't operate to the same extent in the West.
One could argue that the West too is not only the Anglo-Saxon world, where maybe there are some challenges on the family side. But if you look at Southern Europe, for example, you see the same strong family ties. You look at Latin America, which connected with Southern Europe, you see that strong family ties. And so, and they don't seem to be in conflict with this stress on the individual. I would argue that this criticism of the individual is actually a criticism of one of the essential aspects of liberalism. And it's, it's trying to seize greater control for the state. That the state, because when you say who will decide what's right, no, as an individual you shouldn't. So who will decide? Well, the community will decide. That the community means me. It's a kind of state. Am I right in thinking those stuff?
No, and increasingly, I think the state has become much more powerful in India, even under liberalization, in deciding what are the things we can do, we cannot do, what we can say, what we can't say. What we can eat, yeah.
Yes, Bhakti.
I had a question on, since we are at Nayanta, on universities. So Pune University itself, but also Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Allahabad, these have all been great universities in the past and very pioneering. At the same time that social scientists were coming up with theories, the early 20th century Europe, they were coming up, including on environment and so on. So on the one hand, there's been this decline of some of our great public universities, but also on top of that, we have severe, erosion of autonomy of universities also, not just in India, but around the world. So if we have to, address the crisis that you've been talking about, whether it's development, democracy, environment, and so on, how do we see the role of the universities playing out in all of these?
And I'll add my follow-on thing that, and which is, what's your treat for that?
Yeah, so I'd say, that's a very good question, Partha. And I'll say the public universities played you're absolutely right. They played a pioneering role in India. I mean, I'm going to talk about gender. Bombay University was admitting women before Oxford and Cambridge were. Our public universities, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Allahabad, were the first spaces where people of different castes and different genders actually met in public, talked in public, learned in public together. So, and you mentioned the social scientists, but also if we look at the work of Raman, Satyan Bose, Meghnad Saha, all of that was, they have declined. It's tragic, and the different reasons. Someone's write a history of why the public. Like you and I are both entirely the products of Indian public universities. Neither you or I have studied abroad. Both our PhDs and our undergraduate degrees are from Indian public universities, right? So both of us feel it very, very keenly. But I'd say, what are the aims of a university like Nayanta? And I would define it as fulfilling several kinds of pluralism. So the first kind of pluralism is in the student body. So people from across India, different social backgrounds. The university where I studied had people from across India, different social backgrounds. Pluralism in the student body. Pluralism in the faculty. And this is very important. Again, social pluralism. I'll come to intellectual pluralism in a bit. Social pluralism. One of the reasons for the decline of the public university is that in Bombay, only a resident of Bombay could afford housing in Bombay. People don't know that some of the finest teachers in Bombay University in the 50s and 60s and 70s were Bengalis. Some of the finest teachers in Calcutta University were South Indians. Radhakrishnan and Raman made their name in Calcutta University. Now that's impossible because, housing the way you're priced out, and of course. So I think, so it's all Bombay University, Calcutta University only has Bengali. Bombay University has, if not Maharashtrians, people with the Bombay Connect, because only they can go there, outsiders can't go there. So pluralism in the faculty, pluralism in the student body, pluralism in the disciplines. So all disciplines are taught, humanities, sciences. You can take a call as to whether you want, professional schools like, engineering and law. That's third, pluralism in the disciplines. Pluralism within a discipline. Now, this is very important. Now, there have been departments in public universities which are excellent, which taught only one kind of economics. Either they were only neoclassical, or they were only Keynesian, or they were only Marxist. Now, this is all in history. Our JNU, which was rightly had a high reputation, basically taught a Marxist kind of history. They didn't. So pluralism within a discipline. Now, for example, if you're in ecology, not just genetic manipulation, but field research, natural history, mathematics. So pluralism within that is what Delhi University had in its pride, that at least sociology and economics were not one line. And normally in Indian universities, what happens is that there is one great guru, and he may be brilliant, but it's his line, and it's always he, which kind. So pluralism, pluralism in student body, pluralism in faculty, pluralism in discipline is taught, pluralism of intellectual approaches within the discipline. And finally, pluralism in funding sources. So we have some excellent private universities, but at least two of them that started very well because they were funded by one person, and that person, not for the right reasons, found himself in the crosshairs of the regime. There was a problem. So I said these are, and finally, of course, I would say pluralism of universities. We need, because inevitably, much as people like you and me, who are products of public universities, may mourn the decline, it's hard to see the decline being reversed in the short term. Ideally, and Naushad and Ranjan, who have both studied in America, would appreciate this. In England, you only have public universities, or in the continent. The great strength of America is the public and the private. Berkeley is as good as Stanford. The University of Michigan is almost as good as Chicago, but neck to neck. So ideally, you would want that. But till you get that, at least there should be 20 Nayantas. I think it's nice now that they are coming. I think The place where you don't yet have an interesting private university initiative is Eastern India. I don't know, I stand corrected. I mean, you have several in the West. I mean, you have Ahmedabad, you have Nayanta, you have APU, you have Kriya in the South. Of course, you have Ashoka, Jindal, Shiv Nadar. But I think pluralism as conceived in all these ways. And I think that's something which is like a very broad brush recommendation. But I think that's what I will say.
Probably it's a hypothetical question, but let me ask. Since you have studied and on the entire history, even the current politics, political party situation about India, a dream based on the Swaraj, those 4 pillars, what you explained. If India were to really achieve those dreams, who would be the ideal combination of parties or individual, who could really deliver this?
So that is a utopian dream. But I think at the moment, I think we need I think pluralism of parties. I think one part we are going toward. The Congress was a one-party system. India was a one-party system basically from 47 to 77, with a few exceptions. The communists were in power in Kerala for a couple of spells, in Bengal for 2 years. But the Congress India was a one-party state from 47 to 77. And if you look at the real growth of India, not just economic growth, institutional growth, the press, Banmali talked about the Evansi. I was a student in Delhi University of the Evansi, so I remember it vividly. And I've written about India after Gandhi. But the time the Indian press was freest was the 1980s. And Naushad and Banmali may remember it, those who are younger will not, how free it was. The judiciary was most independent in the 1980s and 90s. Actually, our most history will judge, and I'm not an economist, but I still go out on length. History will judge that the Indian economy does better when there's a coalition government in the center representing many different interests, many different states. It's not that Narasimha Rao or Vajpayee or Manmohan Singh who are more able at their job than Narendra Modi. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, so pluralism of that kind. Then one last point I'll make. This is a very underappreciated point. You need, in a state, for a state to succeed, you need a stable two-party system. America is a very large country, so they have Democrats and Republicans. India is too large to have, too diverse to have Congress versus BJP at a national level. So you need, but at the state, the 3 best performing states in India, and actually I don't include Maharashtra. Maharashtra has many other things. In terms of social development, and if you combine social development, high social development and reasonable economic prosperity, arguably the 3 best performing states in India are Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh. And they've all had 2-party systems which compete and alternate. One party dominance in one state, like Bengal in the past, or Gujarat today is not bad. So I'd say that would be my model. 2-party competition in the states, and maybe a diversity of parties. And so because they are so large, it's not just large. America is larger than us, but we are much more diverse. It's like, that is the miracle. That's why I say the creation of India was a miracle. Everyone was convinced in India after Gandhi is peppered with predictions by foreigners from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s saying this will break up. Kashmir and Kerala are too different. They can't stay together. So I think we probably need something of that kind.
Nice. Rajat?
Okay. So we are talking to a group of leaders, and one of the things that at least has bothered me is that if you look at the kind of leaders gaining prominence across the world, whatever we talk about as good leadership, if you say two or three characteristics, narcissism,
Yes.
absolute unwillingness to be vulnerable in any form, to admit failure or anything like that. The idea that you should treat all people with respect is violated. So why are we seeing this trend of
Everywhere. Yeah.
everywhere?
Oh, right. It's everywhere. It's not certainly not restricted in India. It's in America. It's in Latin America. It's in Russia. It's in Turkey. It's in Israel. It may soon reach Western Europe too. Western Europe has been relatively immune. I mean, of course, it may not reach the Nordic countries. I mean, the Nordic countries are, I mean, the most amazing thing with the Nordic countries is how, I suppose still true, is how understated the prime ministers are. I mean,
That's Switzerland.
and Switzerland. And sometimes to their cost. I mean, Olaf Palme was shot dead while walking with his wife to the theatre without anyone. Right? So I think, of course, social media is one. Social media magnifies a person's feelings. It makes you want to look out for a redeemer, and so on. It is a global phenomenon. The strongman phenomenon is global. Now we have it with next door to us with Field Marshal Munir in Pakistan too. And of course Xi Jinping. So I don't really have a handle on it, but clearly it is something that is. Some people would talk about social media. Some people would talk about backlash against globalization and the discontent being channelized by one clever opportunistic leader. Trump, of course, does that very well. Yeah, but it is. I mean, clearly, countries like companies. Countries need teamwork and collectivity. Maybe one person ultimately takes the final call. But cults of personality, charismatic leadership is harmful. In the long run, harmful for a company and harmful for a country. That's what certainly history teaches us that lesson.
Just a point on that, because this rise of the strongman and one the savior has got a very strong coupling with dismissal of scientific temper and expert. As there is this belief that post 2008 and the current globalization rate really do you see a connection there?
Well, that's true. It does go together. I mean, again, Trump is a good example. I mean, any sensible general would have told Putin, don't invade Ukraine. First, look at where he's got. Yeah, I mean, that is a disregard of, and a sense that you can conquer everything. You're above all of that.
So, Rob, last is the Nayanta question, and as I said in my note to you, I'm particularly hesitant to ask you the question about reading. But you have to say, what? Because as Sujanta said, you read a lot. I mean, so Ram helped invaluably, and I was writing my book, and I would send chapters to Ram, and he would send back comments, usually the same night. I mean, and not just a superficial comment, detailed comments, sort of paragraph by paragraph. So, the same, I mean, like 3 hours after I sent it to him.
So, Naushad, I mean, lest you think you're particularly privileged, I've done it for dozens of people. Okay.
Well, dozens of people have benefited from it. But at least if they took.
And it's always nice because at heart I'm also an editor. I learned from them, lots of younger people whose books I've read. I'd say, the only institution I've held, I'm a complete loader. My wife is an entrepreneur. My daughter's an entrepreneur. They've started companies. Many of you are running companies. I am a complete loader. The only piece of collective good I did was I started a foundation called the New India Foundation with the help of Nandan Nilekani, which I have now given over completely, which has published some 40 books, and you can see some of the outstanding books which I have, young people have worked with. But, in terms of reading, Naushad, I have an interesting confession to make. I have realized that at the age I am now, I am 68. I decided this about 3 or 4 years ago. I don't have to keep up with the reading on India. That used to be my job. So it used to be that, I have to write books on Gandhi, I have to write books on Nehru, I've read books on Indian environmental issues, I have to write books on foreigners in India. So my first step was, I will not read fiction on India. So several years I decided, I want to know about the rest of the world. I'm spending too much bloody time studying my own country. I've done it since I was 20 years old. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided I will read fiction set anywhere else. And I'm glad I did that because it allowed me to read Tolstoy, George Eliot, Thomas Mann, some wonderful contemporary writers like Penelope Fitzgerald and Barbara Pym and, Harjin. Yeah. So that now I've taken a further step. That unless I'm absolutely compelled to, unless a friend like Naushad sends me a second book of India, I have to comment on, otherwise I'd lose his friendship. I will also read works of history not set in India. So I've been reading some wonderful books, which I will recommend to you. One is a great environmental history of the modern world called Something New Under the Sun by John McNeill. It's one of the half a dozen greatest books of history I've ever read. It's a book about how the Industrial Revolution from 1850 transformed how we use water, oil, energy, minerals, cropping patterns, and what transformations this has wrought economically and environmentally. It's a blend of economic and environmental history. Something New Under the Sun. It's a fantastic book. Then I read a biography of Cecil Rhodes, the adventurer in South Africa. Then I recently read the book I mentioned, which is very good but not so well written. It was adequately written. A book on modern China by Rana Mitter. Now, this I read. Rana Mitter is was leading historians of modern China. He now teaches at Harvard. Whose father was a very great art historian of India called Partho Mitter, and he's written this book on the Second World War in China. What do the Chinese make of the Second World War? Now, this is quite interesting. The Chinese have discovered that Chiang Kai-shek, whom the communists hated, actually was not such a bad guy. And they have now rewritten the history accurately to show that China, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, that is the communists and the nationalists in the 1930s and 40s, fought against Japanese imperialism. So they say, we are the real victors of the Second World War. The Japanese invaded China in 1937. That is before Hitler invaded Eastern Europe in 1939. Japan invaded America in 1941 with Pearl Harbor. So they have rewritten the history to say, we are the original architects of the post-World War order. So we have as much of a right as America, if not more of a right, to be superpowers today. So it's a book about Chinese history. So I now actually reading a book on interwar Italy. So I find that it's a privilege of growing old that you can do what the hell you want.
That's very nice. That's very well. You know, there's a book, Rana Mitter has another book out. I think it's called After State. Okay. Which I haven't started yet, which is supposed
This is called China's Good War. So basically, it is the Maoist period afterwards.
Yeah.
Then because Chiang Kai-shek had been part of the anti-Japanese effort, they ignored it. Now they've discovered it, made films about it, and so on.
Great. Ram, thank you so much. Thank you for coming to Pune. Thank you.